Welcome everyone to the virtual RAI. It's terrific to see the breadth of geography for people are putting in from where they're coming from in the chat. So welcome to those of you particularly, including one of our speakers who has braved the midnight in Australia to attend today. It's great to have you here. I'm going to give a very short introduction and then I'll be the chair. So as Haneen said, please feel free to leave messages in the chat or raise your hand after the talk. We're entering into a formative age for museums, and particularly for museums that house artifacts and archives collected during the colonial era. The conversation about restitution and repatriation for stolen, looted or coercively collected objects has never been more urgent, elevated in many European countries to national level. But the discussion about repatriation can sometimes obscure the everyday work that goes on in museums and hide the quieter ways in which curators working with collections from other parts of the world have long been working to reconnect communities to objects, to share knowledge, and to build enduring relationships. This work demonstrates how collections are a platform and knowledge base from which to formulate a new global history, one that does not flinch from its responsibilities to address colonialism and its ongoing reverberations into the present. The book that we are here to launch today is an exemplary example of this quieter but committed work, part of ongoing efforts by Anita Herle in Cambridge and Jude Philp in Sydney to reconnect Torres Strait Islanders to their heritage and to facilitate the return of collections in many different forms to communities, to excavate the historical foundations and practices of the discipline of social anthropology at the same time. This work started in the late 1990s in the run-up to the centenary of the 1898 Cambridge expedition to the Torres Strait, and resulted then in a major exhibition in Cambridge and in Torres Strait, an important volume edited by Anita Herle and Sandra Rouse, and an exhibition catalogue authored by Herle and Philp. One of the most important outcomes, however, of the centenary was the process of reconnection it enabled, a two-way traffic of people between Cambridge and Torres Strait, including artist residencies and opportunities for islanders, both young and old, to see objects in Cambridge and connect with them, as well as for researchers to travel to the Torres Strait to work directly in communities there. Unlike the publication of Malinowski's personal diaries in the late 1990s, which called ripples across the discipline as it exposed Malinowski's often shockingly negative and racist attitudes, Haddon's journals were written to be read aloud by family and friends, and his wife Fanny used them to raise interest and support for Haddon's work, and they were also important in arguing for university support for the nascent discipline of anthropology. Unlike Malinowski's journals, which focused much more on his internal life, Haddon's diaries are historical chronicles, not just of that particular moment in the Torres Strait, but also of the formation of anthropological methods, as Haddon shifted his focus in 1888 from zoology to anthropology in his first visit to Torres Strait, before returning with his expanded team of ethnologists, linguists, psychologists, ethnomusicologists, and photographers, cinematographers 10 years later in 1898. Haddon's journals, however, are also still very much of his time. They're imbued with a Victorian language of social evolutionism, and they still evidence the ways in which cultural theories at that time were racialized. They're obvious products of a colonial moment, and they recount in some detail the lifestyles of colonial officials working in Melanesia and Australia at the time. But a key theme that runs across the journals and which makes them enduringly engaging in the day is the warm long-term relationships that Haddon developed with the islanders he worked with. Today, Haddon is remembered fondly in the Torres Strait as someone who was respectful and maintained his personal relationships across time from far away. His lively and generous writing style describes everyday life during his fieldwork as he moved from colonial veranda into local people's homes. Not only making the journals accessible, Anita Herle and Jude Philp have sensitively edited the journals, adding a comprehensive introduction. They do not normalize the Victorian morality in the diaries. They draw attention to places where racialized thinking is both overt and implied, and they make clear when they think views are unacceptable or problematic. They contextualize current affairs, cultural references, and broader networks of people and knowledge in order to place concretely these journals in their time. And the layout of the book itself, and it's a wonderful material artifact, linking detailed footnotes on every page to Haddon's journals, to his field notes and publication, but also crucially to the photographs, drawings, and objects that Haddon collected during his time in the field. Many of the pages, in fact, evoke the exact form of the journals as they are reproduced page by page, interspersed with charming sketches that Haddon put into his diaries. Haddon's objects and images ended up geographically dispersed in Dublin, Cambridge, and London at the British Museum and the Horniman, as well as in Haddon's own private collection. And the volume does much to reunite this multimedia anthropology and contextualize it with an in-depth discussion of the people who made the items and the ways in which Haddon acquired them. The road to return in museum repatriation is long, and it's paved with both obfuscation as well as good intentions. But with the publication of this rich volume, both the inheritors of Haddon's anthropology and the descendants of the communities that he worked with can learn from each other. As the chair of the Torres Strait Islands Sea and Land Council, Luo Ned David, writes in his foreword to the book, and I just want to quote from that because I think it's an important, a really important point made from a Torres Strait Island perspective. He writes, "The publication of Haddon's journals is part of a larger project to access, share, and return material that was generated by the encounter between Haddon and our ancestors. We look forward to building on the relationship we have with Cambridge and working together on future projects. And we're particularly keen to bring back our forebears who have been away from their homeland for a very long time." Without further ado, I want to hand over to our speakers today to present their work in much more detail. They'll talk for about 45-50 minutes, and we'll then have time for the dialogue that I will chair. So I'll just give you a brief introduction to our two authors today. Anita Herle is Senior Curator for World Anthropology at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Cambridge University, where she has particular responsibility for the Pacific and American collections. Her regional interests are very much focused on the Pacific in Torres Strait, Vanuatu and Fiji, but also in Canada, where she has worked on the Northwest Coast and other places. She researches and has written widely on museum anthropology, the early history of British anthropology, art, aesthetics, and visual histories. And within the history of British anthropology, she's explored the intersection between different knowledge systems and the complex relations that develop in the anthropological field, as well as the potency of objects and photographs within these relational encounters. Much of her research is linked to an innovative curatorial practice, and her work is as much evinced through the exhibitions that she has curated as it is through her academic publications. Jude Philp is Senior Curator of the Macleay Collections at the Chow Chak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney in Australia. And like Anita, she's also foundational in her work is about increasing the purposefulness of museum holdings through research and exhibitionary practices. From her initial PhD work with the Torres Strait collections at Cambridge and with the people in the Torres Strait, she has continued to work as an anthropologist concerned with narratives of 19th century collecting of both natural and cultural material in the region. She currently heads the Australian Research Council funded project called Merchants and Museums, which focuses on the commerce in zoological museum collections. And she's also a member of the Excavating McGregor research team, which investigates the making and dispersal of British New Guinea collections. Again, thank you to Jude for joining us at a very late hour in Australia. I'll now hand over to Anita and Jude, who will take over by showing us some more about the fantastic journals of Haddon. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Haidy, for that generous introduction. I'd also like to thank the RAI for hosting the event, and particularly to Amanda and Haneen, who've been great with helping to sort it all out. I'd like to also thank Denise O'Day, our editor at Sydney University Press, and the Haddon family, some of whom are with us today, and the audience. Very much like to thank all of you for coming here, and I really look forward to some of your comments in the discussion. Jude?
Yeah. Mingi Nanawangan, Mari Pujari, Edu Narada. I want to acknowledge the custodians of the land that I'm speaking from, beautiful Gadigal country, and beyond this we acknowledge and thank leaders of the Torres Strait, especially those from Mayor, Tuduyama and Mobiak today and in the past, who worked to ensure the safety and care of their knowledge and traditions when sharing and explaining their culture and history to foreigners. The ideas and work of Torres Strait's elders have been entrusted to linguists, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians over the years, whose publications and support greatly assisted us with this work, and thank you to them also. We also want to acknowledge the generous contributions of the many unnamed Torres Strait Islanders, unnamed Aboriginal and Papua New Guinean peoples who shared their knowledge with Haddon through performances, in the creation of material culture, and through working behind the scenes in gardening and fishing. Awaswal, Kana Eso, thank you, True.
Thank you. So, activating anthropology's archive. At the end of the 19th century, anthropology was an ambitious new discipline linked with colonial expansion. Early field workers gathered vast quantities of data now housed in archives and museums. The theoretical paradigms guiding these undertakings now seem obsolete, but recent collaborative work demonstrates that archives and associated collections retain far-reaching value. The empirical orientation of research in the period and the personal, often intimate nature of field experience and encounter gives ethnographic collections a remarkable salience. The sharing and co-investigation of historical material with communities of origin can be particularly fertile as part of an ongoing process of decolonizing the archive. Today, we're going to discuss a long-term project culminating in the publication of Alfred Haddon's personal journals from his expeditions to the Torres Strait and Southeast New Guinea in 1888 and 1898. The project highlights the enduring value of early anthropological archives for scholarly research and community engagement. It draws on our knowledge of Haddon's work, over 20 years experience of working in and with people from the Torres Strait region, and meticulous archival and collections research. Crucially, the process of publication would have not gone forward without consultation and collaboration with Torres Strait Islander descendants from the communities where Haddon worked. So a brief introduction. Alfred Haddon is renowned by academics and islanders for his groundbreaking work in the Torres Strait. A Cambridge-trained natural scientist, Haddon's anthropological and wider scientific interests developed during his 1888 field trip to study marine biology. Haddon worked closely with islanders who assisted him collecting reef specimens and shore dredging. And over time, he became fascinated with islander custom. He shared the concerns expressed by elders that their customary beliefs and practices were under threat. Determined to record detailed ethnographic information, he returned as the leader of the 1898 Cambridge Anthropological Expedition to the Torres Strait. The goals and expertise of the 7 expedition members reflected an extremely comprehensive vision of anthropology, incorporating the study of local customs and beliefs, physiology, experimental psychology, medicine, physical anthropology, linguistics, and art. The expedition's work was focused on the islands of Mare in the eastern Torres Strait and Mabiag in the lower Western Islands, but they also did comparative research on other Torres Strait islands and in the top of Cape York and in the New Guinea and the adjacent southeast area of New Guinea. Given the close personal relationships that Haddon developed over the first expedition at both islands, the expedition was warmly welcomed and presented with gifts of food. Haddon describes the expedition's arrival on Mare. I was affectionately greeted by my old friend Passy and by the Mamoose. It was gratifying to find them ready to take up our friendship where we had left it. On Mabiag, Haddon wrote, on Tuesday morning before breakfast, a procession of men, women, and children came from the village into the mission compound and deposited before our door a present of a large number of coconuts, watermelons, 1 yam, some taro, several eggs, 2 cocks, and a hen. The spokesman said that the island was poor in garden produce and they couldn't give us much. And just to note that unlike the Eastern Islands with rich volcanic soil and lush gardens, the Western Islands are the granite remains of the land bridge that once connected Australia with New Guinea, and they are much less fertile. Haddon directed the expedition's work and focused on documenting local customs, religious ceremonies, and decorative art. Collecting was central to his research methodology. The classification and comparison of large numbers of specimens within the natural sciences had demonstrated the analytic potential of large collections. In the introduction to his book, The Evolution of Art, published after the first expedition, Haddon claimed that he was, quote, simply a biologist who had his attention turned to the subject of decorative art, to show that delineations have an individuality and a life history. Haddon aimed to make an exhaustive collection of material culture. He could get just as excited about a garden hoe, as the quote here shows, as an elaborate turtle shell mask. Material culture, along with human physical characteristics and language, was deemed to provide insights into human diversity and variation over space and time. Haddon claimed in his 1888 journal, "I value the information I have gathered concerning the things as being of more value. There is no merit in mere collecting." Haddon also commissioned relics of objects that no longer existed, such as the sacred Melubomai masks on Mare, which were made out of cardboard from Haddon's packing crates. He used information in his collections and the process of making new objects as a means of eliciting information from people to animate and thereby better understand parts of a yarn or an impromptu performance. He used drawings in a similar way, prompting comments on the sketches in his notebooks and encouraging islanders to make their own drawings of the topics under discussion. Haddon's methodology focused on the performative aspects of culture, and his interests highlight the centrality of music and dance in the maintenance and dissemination of customary knowledge. Photography was also crucial to Haddon's work, and nearly 1,400 unique images in the Torres Strait, New Guinea, and Cape York were taken during the two expeditions. There was an implicit and complex relation between the collection of objects and the collection of images, both intended later for comparative analysis. Photographs were often used to document material culture, as well as the physical characteristics of individuals. Other common subjects included dancing, feasts, ceremonial reenactments, people, and customary activities. And it is telling that there are very few photographs of contemporary innovations or the numerous missionaries, traders, and colonial officers that are referenced in the journals. Originally intended as a form of documentation and a means of soliciting information, photography was quickly enmeshed in the interpersonal dynamics of fieldwork. As Elizabeth Edwards has shown, that images provide insights into the relationships that developed in the field, as well as Haddon's methodologies. Photographs also became part of local gift exchange. Family portraits were made at islanders' request and often featured Haddon's key assistants. In 1898, the expedition's public lantern shows were extremely popular. The centrality of music and dance to the lives of islanders, Aboriginal people, and Papuans, alongside Haddon's fascination with the performative aspects of everyday and ceremonial life, permeates the journals. Haddon was privileged to witness a range of ceremonial performances. He describes occasions on which he paid for dance, and he prompted reenactments of sacred ceremonies believed to have died out, although it appears that at least some of them had simply gone underground. In addition to providing rich ethnographic and historic information, Haddon's journals provide unique insights into the goals and practices of anthropological fieldwork at the very time that the fieldwork is being established as the central methodology for the emergent discipline. Human variation over time was a central concern, and the 1898 expedition members brought with them a wide range of recording and testing equipment, including psychological and reaction tests intended to identify racial differences. Rivers took the lead in researching the physiology of the senses. Islander assistants actively and at times competitively participated in the tests, which aimed to measure color perception, tactile sensations, hearing, and smell. Well, when the results were compared with those of British test subjects, including members of the expedition, they revealed larger variations within test groups than between them, demonstrating that the capacities of islanders and English people were similar. While the rigors of scientific testing were debated, ultimately, the results were used to challenge Eurocentric theories of innate or evolved superiority. The journals show how encounters with islanders called into question the expedition members' assumptions and helped to transform some of their methods and interpretations. With the assistance of named islanders, the work of Haddon and the expedition member generated an enormous corpus of information and materials, including indigenous drawings, hundreds of objects, over 1,000 field photographs, as well as sound recordings, film, zoological and plant specimens, and kinship charts. The extensive data published in the 6 volumes of the expedition's reports remains foundational for researchers working in the area. They continue to be of great interest to lineal and cultural descendants and are a source of inspiration for islander artists. They've also been extensively cited in local affirmations of island custom and in native title claims. And I think in particular, the landmark Mabo case in 1992, where information from the reports were used in the Queensland courtroom to overturn 200 years of terra nullius in Australia. And since then, there have been successful claims, C claims in 210 and 213, both of which drew on material from the report. So it's given this work a particular political spin. Of importance to islanders is Haddon's practice of naming key men that he worked with and the attribution of knowledge to particular islands. Well, the fieldwork and analysis focused on the Torres Strait. On both expeditions, Haddon did comparative research in Southeast New Guinea and in Cape York. And Jude is going to discuss a little bit about the difference between the Torres Strait work and the work in New Guinea. But first, for over 2 decades, Jude and I have done research on the collections in Cambridge, worked with communities in the Torres Strait, and hosted numerous islander visitors to Cambridge. And as you can see from a couple of these slides, islanders have been particularly keen, they're always keen, to meet members of the Haddon family. Our focus has been to collaboratively research the archives and collections in Cambridge and to make material accessible to people in the Torres Strait and other scholars working in the region. Well, the museum has lent Torres Strait objects to islander exhibitions in Australia, and we returned print and digital copies of all of Haddon's photographs to their islands of origin in 2011. Access to Haddon's detailed journals has been restricted to people who are able to visit the Cambridge University Library. The islanders who have visited the manuscripts room were delighted to see the original journals and other items in the vast Haddon papers. Katrina Dean and other staff at the University Library have been extremely supportive of the publication project and have been fantastic in providing access to islander visitors and being sensitive to appropriate cultural protocols. So I'm now going to hand over to Jude, who's going to talk about some of the contents of Haddon's journals and his work in New Guinea.
Thanks, Anita. Can people hear me a little bit better now?
Yes.
Yes. Thanks. Haddon's journals were written and sent as pages to his wife Fanny, as Heidi was saying, to be shared with a select group of family, academic supporters and friends. Written with relative informality, they include around 18 months of day-to-day musings on his work, observations about people he was working with, musings on colonial rule and about commerce, as well as more personal things like international affairs and the war in the Philippines, his health, family jokes, and his reading habits. References to the hundreds of foreigners, traders, missionaries, and colonial officers are threaded throughout the narrative. The journals are also laced with details about when and where he collected objects, stories and the songs, his work with photography, and the personal difficulties he faced. In this way, they are invaluable context to the formal reports and allow one to read Haddon's zoological and ethnographic interests against the grain. And here is just a page that gives you a sense of what the reports are like as a constant fact-based theory as opposed to the enjoyment of the journal. In communicating this wealth of information back to Cambridge, Haddon relied upon sketches to detail scenes and objects that were difficult to communicate or photograph. These lively drawings populate the journals and make obvious his intersecting interests in marine biology, geology, geography, and above all, his focus on documenting the histories of islanders, Aboriginal and Southeast Papua New Guinean coastal peoples. Concerned to capture the appropriate language names, he used drawings also, like in this bottom right-hand drawing, to work with people to correct details and label elements in language. While Haddon's main goal was to record information about past, or what he liked to call traditional beliefs and practices, his journal includes vignettes of everyday life that reveal the influx of people and the new ideas that were coming into the region. He includes descriptions of his attempt to descend in a diving suit, for instance, and of joining in local games and competitions. At one point he writes, "This evening there was a play. It now seems to be the fashion for the people on one side of the island to learn new songs from Thursday Island and fishing boats. They go at intervals to other villages on the opposite side of the island and then sing them. After a few days' interval, a return. The visitors were all dressed in their Sunday best. The girls stood in a clump in the middle and sang Japanese and other songs. Then a man with a whistle walked around the middle and walked round and around and said, 25 cents for a ride," or something like that, or something to that effect. Next, a number of men arranged themselves in pairs, like spokes of a wheel radiating from the hub of girls. The latter sang a tune and the men walked round and round the girls, gradually going faster and faster. This was an imitation of a merry-go-round, which had, for the last 2 years, paid a visit to Thursday Island. The first year, the owners made a clear profit of £1,600 for 3 months' work. Haddon is generally myopic in dealing with modernity in the reports in other ways. The commercially successful merry-go-round at TI is mentioned because Miriam Leigh bring back the dances and Japanese songs for local competitions, which were more traditional. Rotuma dances introduced by missionaries are captured on the phonograph, but not otherwise discussed. A dance by Aboriginal men working on a bêche de mer boat was filmed at Mer, but otherwise undocumented. While it's frustrating when the details of these things are not given, Haddon's brief observations are enough to make obvious the modernity of the innovative, multicultural, and highly mobile populations of the region during this time. Reading across the two journals gives a sense of growing understanding and trust between Haddon and his interlocutors. And here we've got a page of Haddon's personal photograph album, showing Passy, his main friend and informant in Mer, who assisted his work there, and a visual joke made with Morbiag clan leaders Gizu, Peter, Tom, and Warrior, posed in exactly the same position as the various identities of the expedition members. Haddon developed an active participation of islanders, and they who were concerned with the documentation of their culture. Warrior at Mobiag, Mainu at Yamatudu, Pasi at Mare were nascent leaders in '88 who became instrumental and really vital in coordinating the activities for Haddon by 1898. In 1888, Haddon writes of his excitement but also frustration in documenting sacred ceremonies at Mare when he was less well acquainted with people and they with him. People were only willing to show Haddon the public side of ceremonies. This you can see on the left-hand side with a very strange version of the Malu mask, which he had from his brief discussions with people. By 1898, a greater number of Meriam Lay clan leaders were willing for the expedition leaders to record the sacred languages, songs, and some of the more restricted and private performances connected to Malu. The journals give the social context of these performances and Haddon's unshakable doubts about the lived integrity of what he was seeing, never quite realising the generational barriers that prevented younger men from talking freely. He wrote, "We were taken to the sacred ground at Gazir," which you can see in this top right-hand photograph, and shortly afterwards the men assembled and went through a representation of the first ceremony when the sacred mask was shown to the lads who were to be initiated. There were just sufficient echoes of it, as it were, to enable us to catch something of the old solemnity. Since then, we've spent very many days in going over details of ceremony and songs. Work of this kind, which appears so simple when written, is surprisingly difficult and tedious to collect. There is also little doubt that they do not care to speak freely about the sacred rites they revealed in the past. I am alluding, of course, to the old men, for even middle-aged men know very little, and the young men, nothing. A similar kinds of reactions occurred and slow confidence with Haddon occurred at Mobiag with the documentation of the culture hero Koyam and at Tudu with the leader Mainu. These Torres Strait Islands were fieldwork sites almost in a modern understanding, places Haddon lived in for months and worked closely with local people and to an extent collaborated with them in the production of knowledge through the reports. When Haddon travelled out of the Torres Strait, his work was aimed at collecting comparative details and facts to contribute to the understanding of islanders' histories and back one, Anita, to contribute to the collecting of facts and the understanding of islanders' histories and to capture a description of pre-colonial life. In this, he seldom worked directly with Gudang, Yadagana of Cape York or Papua New Guineans, Kiwai, Roro, Mekio, Motu and Koyari peoples, documented in his diaries, photographs and recordings, but was far more reliant on government colonists, traders and missionaries. So here are a couple of the missionaries who were working at Kiwai, for instance, who showed him around, and a group of 24 photographs taken in the government officer Valentine's compound. At the beginning of Haddon's 1888 expedition, he travelled to Cape York and then to Mawata with the acting resident Hugh Millman. The influence of government attitudes towards Indigenous people is evident in Haddon's early description of being taken to meet a family at Cape York. In language he does not repeat again, he writes, "So they were photographed squatting in their apology for a house, some of the lowest of God's human creatures." A month later, he wrote of his horror witnessing a Thursday Island Australian pearl shell party in honour of Millman with 26 men he identified as hard drinkers. The post-prandial guzzling was sickening, and the whole performance was, I think, by far the most revolting sight I have seen in my life. And these are they who despise the Aborigines of the islands. Another effect of his survey work in Papua New Guinea is that Haddon's writing becomes much more journalistic, reflecting his distance from the people and acceptance of what Europeans told him. His writing in Papua New Guinea is flavoured with the prejudicial and common view of an excitable kind of people, from whom European forms of civilization were deemed to be productive. In contrast to Torres Strait, Papua New Guinean individuals are seldom identified by name. One exception is this gentleman, Guwe, the chief of Agi, a member of a confederacy that attempted to stop the colonial inroads beyond the Sageri highlands for a considerable time, who Haddon meets over the course of several days, but provides details of the battles from the gossip of the Papua New Guinean officers. An advantage of his government associations was the opportunity to record performances such as this one, which was dances between several villages along the Aroma coast, this one at Babaka, but also including Kalo people, which was part of a larger festival that the Queensland Governor, Lord Lamington, and British New Guineans Governor Sir William McGregor were to witness. Through this, Haddon was able to spend considerable time developing methodologies for dances and games. Continuously invested in ceremonial dances, he was frustrated by his ability to capture these to the point of replication, as he did more successfully later with string figures and songs. Haddon's first journal charts the move of missionaries based at Mare and Thursday Island in the Torres Strait over to New Guinea, where they really aspired to work. In 1888, Haddon had relied on the London Missionary Society and the Roman Catholic Sacred Heart missionaries to aid him. Can we have the next slide, Anita? And his own knowledge of missionary history thrusts him into the sorry, it's gone a little over. We're looking for Reverend Hunt and Savage. Sorry, while Anita finds them. His own knowledge of missionary history thrusted him into the midst of mission politics. He was at Mare in 1888 at a time when the headquarters, there we are, at a time when the headquarters of the Mission and Training Institute moved from Mare to Port Moresby, and when the resident government was forced to resolve conflicts the missionaries Hunt and Savage had created. He was most personally upset when the missionaries had refused to give last rites to a dying woman because she confessed to adultery. But while open in his critique of Hunt and Savage, Haddon was more cautious writing about family friends such as their one-time boss, Reverend Samuel McFarlane, who had pioneered the Torres Strait New Guinea mission from the Mare Institute. In 1898, Haddon visited the new institute at Vatarata near Port Moresby, run by the Reverend and Mrs. Laws. Writing to Fanny, it's obvious that he is cautious in his communications. He knew of conflicts between family friends Samuel McFarlane and William Laws, and about the location of the institute in Tobacco, and would have heard slurs against McFarlane's exaggerations of numbers of devotees in the field. Yet he writes only, Dr. and Mrs. Laws gave us a very cordial reception. The former is a patriarch, the latter is very bright. First working with Father Vergis in Thursday Island to document Karareg songs, it was the new base of the Sacred Heart mission at Yule Island that he, Ray and Welkin stayed in July of 1898. Musing on the different values of the Catholic versus Protestant style of mission, he was particularly heartened to see that the mission dresses, as you see here with a group of women on Mare, worn across the region, were not imposed upon women as keenly as they were by the LMS during church and after. Because the journals contain so much detail of what Islander scholar Martin Nakata has identified as the triad of colonialism, commerce, governance and Christian mission, along with intimate passages about Islanders' lives and connections back to his own world in Cambridge, Anita and I believed that the potential of the journals for publication to a wide audience was possible, as she will go on to relate now.
Plans to publish the journals were first discussed during a field trip to the region in 2016. We met with Islander representatives, including direct descendants of the people who worked with Haddon from the 4 main island communities where his research was based: Gumagal on Mabiag, Miriam on Mare, Kukugal from Ilama, and Aboriginal representatives from the Karawig Nation on Muralag. PowerPoint presentations were prepared for each community, focusing on material that came from their respective islands. While the presentations were generally well received and prompted much interest and discussion, overall people were cautious and needed more time and information to make decisions about publication. Over the next years, we worked on transcribing the journal and sent hard copies of transcriptions to families and community representatives. Following intermittent communications, by mid-2017, we received enthusiastic and unanimous approval from our Islander advisors to go ahead with the project. In October 2018, we went back to the Torres Strait to report on progress and publication plans. As in 2016, we conducted small group meetings with people from the 4 island groups where Haddon based his research. We also gave presentations at larger community meetings and to the board members of the Torres Strait Regional Authority who offered their support. Discussions about Haddon's diaries were articulated within contemporary concerns. The interest in understanding more about the past in order to reinvigorate customary knowledge and practices, the maintenance of cultural protocols in the distribution of knowledge, and the ongoing negotiations within and between individual communities regarding rights and ownership of knowledge, sea, and land. We agreed that the journals for Torres Strait and New Guinea needed to be published in its entirety, every word and sketch. As Islanders said, the publication needed to be true to Haddon, despite Haddon's use of racist language typical of the late Victorian period. Given patchy internet access and a limited number of personal computers in the outer islands, it was deemed essential to have a hard copy publication that could be readily distributed in the Torres Strait. Jude and I were conscious of the difficulties people have in working with institutional collections and people's interest in finding specific items related to their family and community histories. Islanders strongly supported our proposal to link Haddon's narrative with his extensive collections held in Cambridge and various institutions in Ireland, in the UK, Ireland, and Australia, and to provide details as to how these collections can be accessed. And here we've got an example of the Karawig men from Port Lihu who performed a war dance for Haddon, following which he traded for them with all the dance ornaments, and the footnote references the related collections at the BM, Cambridge, and Dublin. People were particularly enthusiastic to see photographs of named ancestors, which often provoked a strong emotional response. We agreed that we would work to identify the name of as many people as possible, building on Haddon's care in naming and identifying people in his photographs, and the research that has collectively been done on the images over the last 25 years. Examples of a photo of a feast on, here we have an example of a photo of a feast on Mare with people standing around an earth oven, and a note that Haddon wrote detailing the names of many people that are shown, which we tried to translate. Across the Torres Strait, there was a common decision to reject our initial plan to include Islander commentaries about their ancestors or Haddon's research. Initially, I think we imagined that there could be, the journals with this sort of running Indigenous commentary throughout the book, but they didn't want that. Contemporary knowledge about people and places is deemed personal and was not considered appropriate for publication. Prompted by Haddon's writings, Islanders would tell their own stories about the journals for their own purposes once they had been published. Denise O'Day at Sydney University Press was extremely supportive of the project throughout the publication process. Given the huge amount of visual material and the importance of having a book that looked and felt good, SUP agreed to produce a high-quality, full-color publication in addition to an ebook. Unusually for an academic press, SUP allowed Jude and I to get directly involved in the design and layout of the book. And in the end, we went through 4 sets of page proofs, juggling images with text. Graphic designer Deborah Wickham greatly assisted us with finalizing the cover. Now, a bit about the cover. The image references performance and Haddon's passion for recording and hints at some of the complexity of untangling Haddon's journals, a complexity which underlies their intellectual value. It is a colored print based on Haddon's photographs and descriptions of the Wai-tutu cap, or dance of the sawfish, which he saw on Thursday Island in November 1888, just at the end of his first trip. Haddon published the image in his 1898 article, The Secular and Sacred Dances of the Torres Strait, and took a copy of this article back to the Torres Strait in 1898, referred to it on numerous occasions in the journals, and showed it to his islander friends. Well, the conventional style of the colored drawing might suggest that this dance was staged. In fact, Haddon was very privileged to witness this event, which took place just before he left TI. The Wai-tutu cap was marked by extensive preparations for mask making, costumes, and waris, or stage, which is shown in the background. Carreg men came together over several days and nights to rehearse and perform the seasonal songs and dances, and thereby asserted their ownership of the Carreg to their land, i.e. Thursday Island, which had been brutally appropriated for European purposes. The Wai-tutu cap can be seen as an act of self-determination and subversion, qualities which also can be seen to underlie some of the performances that were done as reenactments, such as Melu Bamai on Mare. It is revealing that Haddon never attempted to collect these masks, presumably because he thought they were inauthentic. The masks were creatively made of kerosene tins and bits of painted wood, which Haddon described as having a tawdry appearance. It was important to us that the Wai-tutu cap brings together elements from different parts of the Torres Strait region. The lyrics refer to fish weirs, which are constructed in the Eastern Islands, and the style of headdress references those made in the Central Islands and Western District of New Guinea. During community consultations on Mare, this Carreg incorporation of elements from across the region was raised as a concern. Why were Carreg referencing things that belong to Mare? The inclusiveness of the whole archive, the integration of the journals with the extensive associated materials in Cambridge and elsewhere is something that we were concerned about. And we are really grateful to Denise O'Day at SUP and the Indigenous Music of Australia series editorial board that this was never an obstacle to the book's publication, but rather an opportunity to be explored. The book gave us the opportunity to show how the collections fit together with drawings, photos, descriptions, and sound recordings brought together in the text and in the footnotes. And here's just a couple of examples of pages. Here's women's ornaments, and then the ornament that's being referenced in the British Museum. The text and journal sketches are cross-referenced with over 200 associated field photographs, Indigenous drawings, and images of some of the objects collected. With the exception of our introduction, we made the decision to only include objects and field photographs that were referred to in Haddon's text. And you can see that running along the side in the columns are the page references to the original journals. There we go. Oh, sorry. Apologies. Fortuitously, The British Library had just begun a project called True Echoes to research, digitize, and work with communities of origin around their collection of wax cylinders produced by anthropologists working in the Pacific. And these include Haddon's Torres Strait cylinders transferred to the British Library from Cambridge. Working with the list of cylinder titles, Jude combed through the journals and was able to match many of the cylinders to the specific places and dates referred to in their journals. We were also able to juxtapose related material currently housed in different institutions. For the first time, we were able to bring together these three similar outstanding turtle shell masks, which were collected early in Haddon's first expedition over 2 days in August 1888 in the Central Islands, and now in the collection of Cambridge, the British Museum, and the National Museum of Ireland. Likewise, we were able to bring together dance ornaments from a performance staged for Haddon on Tudu. Mainu, the man shown playing the drum, Jude has referred to him earlier, was a very influential Kokagral leader who maintained long-distance alliances with people on the New Guinea coast and through the Central Islands to other regions in the Torres Strait. Mainu went on to become an ally and close friend of Haddon. Haddon worked with him in 1888 and 1898 and visited him with his daughter Kathleen in 1914 on their way from Australia to New Guinea. The book is a substantial introduction which provides the historical context for the journals, including Haddon's background and some of the geographical and colonial settings in the Torres Strait regions. We also explore some of the main themes that underline the journals, the anthropological concerns, collecting, photography, performance, and etc. Islander colleague Ned David of the Sea and Land Council, as well as the Torres Strait Islander Regional Educational Council, and Leah Louis Chavez in the Department of History at the University of Sydney, generously provided their perspectives in the foreword and the epilogue. And I think Haidy read a bit from what Ned said at the beginning in her introduction. So I'm now going to let Jude finish off by talking a bit about the distribution of the book and to conclude our presentation.
So we are so grateful for the support of the Torres Strait Regional Authority, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, the University of Monash Indigenous Studies Centre, as well as the Haddon family, all of who assisted with some of the costs of preparing the publication and, really importantly, subsidising well over 100 copies for free distribution to schools, libraries, council offices and community organisations throughout the Torres Strait and on mainland Australia. It was because we knew the book was going to get to people intimately connected to the stories and objects in the journals that we made that concerted effort to include the museum numbers for each of the objects and various other things mentioned in the journals so that people could get an easy way into an archive to find the further objects and connections, which, as Anita said, are so personally relevant to them. Due to COVID restrictions, it's a really great disappointment not to be able to take the book directly back to the communities we worked with over many years and who collaborated with us to do this. Instead, we've been doing this remotely, like many across the world, with the support of our Islander colleagues. Tagayah State College on Thursday Island, the administrative centre of the Torres Strait, assisted with distributing copies of the books to the outer islands, where they oversee all the primary schools, which are thought to be the safest location from an Islander point of view for the books to stay, for everybody to be able to access. As part of the process of distribution, we tried as hard as possible to be careful to follow appropriate protocols. Copies were sent first to the individuals who closely assisted us during the process of preparing the publication, who also included those families connected to the leaders that we've mentioned in this presentation. We were fortunate that shortly after the publication, there was an important meeting of all the prescribed body corporates who are a particular leadership group identified across Australia. So we were able to ensure that each of them got a copy of the book before copies were sent to TI for more general distribution. And this opportunity to think and look at material before talking is something that Islanders were very keen that we maintained some perspective on. Approximately 2/3 of Islanders live in the Australian mainland, and we're currently working with IAXIS to distribute copies of the book to Islander organisations and Indigenous cultural centres throughout Australia. Distribution to Papua New Guinea has been more difficult. COVID prevented a visit during the writing period to alert specific communities to its publication, and distribution has now been hampered by COVID, only recently rampant, sadly, in that country. Universities, Uniting and Sacred Heart headquarters, National Archives and museums will receive copies in Papua New Guinea, with further distributions via networks of those currently working with Papua New Guinean peoples mentioned in the journals. So in concluding, we want to consider some of the legacies of Haddon's expeditions to Torres Strait and New Guinea. The success of the 1898 Anthropological Expedition had a significant impact on Haddon's career and marked a crucial turning point in the professionalisation of British anthropology. The expedition members enthusiastically disseminated their findings in publications and presentations shortly after their return. Following much lobbying with the University of Cambridge, Haddon was finally appointed to the first lectureship in ethnology in 1900. The veterans of the Torres Strait expedition, Haddon and Rivers in Cambridge, Seligman at the London School of Economics, alongside a few colleagues at the University of Oxford, taught the first generation of academically trained anthropologists, as well as government administrators and missionaries that Haddon was very concerned learnt the lessons that he had learnt in Britain, and promoted the extensive fieldwork that is the central methodology for the emerging discipline. After Haddon's retirement in 1925, his work was seen as antiquated and largely ignored by social anthropologists in Britain and elsewhere. Yet Haddon's collections and the detailed information in the reports have continued to be a crucial resource for islanders and researchers working in the region. Haddon's work gained widespread political prominence, as Anita mentioned, in 1992 with the landmark Murray Island land case. And information from the reports was also used for sea claims and in further claims that are underway, as well as for more personal cases along the islands. Haddon's careful documentation of ritual sites has been of particular importance by islanders as a means of investigating long-standing questions about their own past in archaeological work with people connected to universities down south. Rivers' genealogies are widely circulated within the Strait. Seligman's collection of botanical specimens has been attracted interest as comparative samples for investigating environmental change most recently. RAI's extensive work on Torres Strait languages has been foundational for linguists and is an important resource for contemporary islanders who are working to revitalise traditional languages across the Torres Strait. Mai's work in recording music set a pattern in ethnomusicology for the region and elsewhere, and the objects and drawings, of course, continue to be an important source of inspiration for islander artists. We look forward to seeing the impact of the publication of Haddon's journals. And in concluding, I end with a quote from the epilogue written by Leah Louis-Chivese, a colleague and a descendant of some of those from the journals in the History Department of the University of Sydney. She writes, "Away from raking over the past and answering our existing questions, perhaps the greatest gift will be the new questions and directions the journals will provoke. This publication should inspire new ways to think about and grapple with how knowledge about us was discerned and given scientific credence through Haddon's work. It is my hope, Leah's hope, that the significance of these journals will be revealed in the varieties of histories and stories that islanders and others will tell and write. In finding these stories, we will need to read closely, looking carefully underneath and inside Haddon's words, to see the silences and the spaces that make writing back a necessary act of recovery. And in our engagements, we won't be burdened by the station Haddon assigned to our ancestors in his writings, but motivated to revise, rewrite, and represent our untold stories as genealogies in song, art, dance, and drama, in print and on screen. They will be stories and creative work that will both speak back and say much, much more about who we were and are always becoming. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Jude and Anita for that fantastic overview of the very rich journals of Haddon. We've got a few minutes left so we can have questions, and perhaps whilst some of you are composing your thoughts or thinking about whether you want to put your hand up or type into the chat, I might ask a question just to get us going. I mean, one of the things I really appreciated from your talk and also from the project, and I think this is a theme or a current that's emerging in the return to the archive across anthropology, is the way in which the story of these foundational moments of fieldwork is actually a story of collaboration and exchange, not just of extractive or kind of the anthropologist coming and being the expert in the local culture. So we have the story in America of Boas's main interlocutor, George Hunt, being a kind of primary, not just a source or informant, but a collaborator in a lot of Boas's work. And I know that Haddon was actively engaged in correspondence, and I was interested in reading the journals to see that several people from Torres Islands gave him diaries and books of their own that they had written themselves to take back to Cambridge. So I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more about what was happening in the Torres Strait in terms of the Indigenous research in between 1888 and 1898, or in that early period when Haddon was going back and forth, what was happening in terms of knowledge circulating to Cambridge from the Torres Strait perspective. So if you could just give us some of those details, because they're a really fantastic part of the story.
Right. I can have a start with that one. I mean, unlike what some of the stereotypes might be of a Victorian scientist, Haddon from the beginning was always keen to let the islanders know what he was doing. And we spoke in the presentation about the example of him taking one of his articles back. And, you know, there are passages in the journal where he discusses people's response to it. And some of the images in those articles were of identifiable, people in, like, Mainus in it, Passis in it, various people that they're there. So they actually got to see themselves in print. Some of the islanders were literate, not all of them. On some of the islands, for example, on Mare, Jack Bruce, who was the local school teacher for many decades, was an intermediary in showing material to Haddon. I mean, showing material from Haddon to islanders after he was back in Cambridge, because Haddon sent copies of not just his articles, but actually sent copies of the reports, or at least the first reports. They were published over a long period of time, back to the islands to where they refer. So and you see that they generated much interest and discussion. So they were aware of what was happening and using it in their own ways. Waria, who was on Mabiag, who was a hereditary chief on Mabiag and probably Haddon's main assistant there, along with Gizu, was literate. He'd done a lot of training, and he could write in Kalalagaya in his own language. And he sent Haddon, and we have it in the manuscripts room of the university library, a 300-page document written in Kalalagaya, which is probably, well, as far as we know, the earliest and by far the longest journal written in a Melanesian language anywhere, anytime, at that period. So they were very interested in seeing how it was used. Do you have anything to add, Jude?
I guess I'd just add that the first printing of both Meriam Mir, the language of the Eastern Islands, and Kalagaya was in the 1870s with the missionaries. They were publishing translations of the Bible and hymns very early. So you do have quite a long period of time that people are learning what other people are doing. And in the 1860s, you had thousands of people coming into the Strait and disrupting older orders of work and life and communication. So I guess in some ways the familiarity with foreigners was not something, was quite unusual for the Torres Straits. There were a lot of foreigners there. They had long-term communication with people over decades, and Haddon is there as one of the people who perhaps he writes of only people who's interested in them for their own sake and in what they're doing. So that relationship over a long distance, I think, is part of that whole melange of things that are happening over the 30 years.
Thank you. Got lots of questions coming. I see people, I can see Jeremy McClancy's face, but I'll read his question out because you just put your hand up. And so Jeremy asks, were there no negative views of Haddon in the Torres Islands today? There
are people in the same way as anywhere resent the certain ways that people have compartmentalized them, have talked about them, have isolated particular customs and ideas, have been part of mainstream colonization and used information for their own ends. But at the same time, probably because of the very collaborative nature of Haddon's work, which comes out in the reports, it is obvious to anybody who reads that people were telling him to safeguard certain kinds of information. So that, whether or not they like him as a person, the product of what he did is so important that there's another life about that.
Just to add something about the naming, I mean, Haddon attributes, even in the reports, he attributes knowledge to named people, and that's so important because it's the voices of their ancestors. So he will say things like, and about this, Passy said X, and actually quote him. And people use that to read against the grain in the journals as well, and to also see where the information is coming from and whether the person would have had the right knowledge to be able to discuss that in detail. So they use it to evaluate things. They're also, obviously, Rivers's kinship charts have been very important and also have their own political component. But even today, people have photocopied pages of the kinship charts from the reports and other bits of the reports that they keep with themselves at home. And sometimes I have met people in Torres Strait, and of course know that I'm coming from Cambridge, or who I've met before, and they will say things like, oh, our family's not page number 43, and or chart number 43, as a way of addressing us.
Yeah, it reminds me of the work that Anita and I also did in Vanuatu with John Layard's archive, where his book is called The Bible and the Dictionary, but at the same time is also part of hugely contested knowledge politics that's locally, it's not straightforward sort of representation of the past. I have a question from Joy Hendry, who is asking how much of the research was disseminated in Australian universities at the time?
It's an interesting thing. Haddon was involved in both the setting up of the anthropology department at the University of Sydney, the first anthropology department in Australia. So he's intimately involved in making anthropology in Australia a thing. He was also out here for the Pan-Pacific Congress and talked with various people and geographers, mainly in Australia, who were working in anthropological kinds of ways. But Australia, like everywhere, was, if you like, seduced by the Malinowski principles, which pushed away, ironically, Haddon from the idea of field work. They were considered, because of the reports and the way that they're written, as really not relevant anymore to the new forms of anthropology that were coming through. And when I was an undergraduate at Sydney University, even with people who had worked in the Torres Strait, like Jeremy Beckett, as teachers. We didn't learn anything about Haddon. Nothing.
It's like Cambridge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting kind of revising of anthropology's history that's coming through. I think that would not be the case now. I think now we teach about the formation of the discipline starts with the 1898 expedition. It's very much part of your work that has brought that into the university. There are a couple of questions I'm going to group together, which are about the distribution that you were discussing right at the end, Jude. So Andrea Derry's asking if you plan to create an online version, and so thanks you for the presentation. And then Vicky Barnacut is saying, when you distribute copies in Papua New Guinea, will you also focus on depositing in primary schools, or where more specifically are you planning to distribute those in PNG? So maybe we can just talk a bit more broadly about distributing the book from those two questions.
Jude, do you?
Yeah, sure. I've forgotten the first question already, but in terms of primary schools, it is a factor of many smaller and even large towns like Carlo that the school is a centre that's seen to be the most stable, least political place around. And certainly, if that's where we're directed to put the books, that's where we will put them. It's just not being able to be there to talk to people, to plan and work through all of those things. And we do not want to encourage people to sit together closely and look at something like this either. We just need to take our time. And so really, if anybody in the audience has suggestions about where they think the book should go, I'm really happy to hear those as we plan on how we get the books out and distribute them as COVID starts to dissipate, hopefully in the coming year. I've forgotten the first question.
Another question from Andrea was about, are you creating an online version? And I know there is an ebook, because that was in the flyer, but so I don't know if that answers the question, or if there's any more web-based presence that you might have.
Yeah, there is an ebook which is coming out later because of the concern to make sure that islanders were able to read it and to consider it before it sort of had bigger readership across internationally. Anita?
Yes, I mean, we've updated some of our resources at the museum in terms of primarily the photographs, but also some of the objects to make that accessible. In terms of making the book, as Jude said, there is an ebook, but also Cambridge University Library at some point, I think, would like to put up the original journals online as part of their process of developing a digital library. But that's something that is going to take a little while. And because we were producing a book at first, they're sort of holding back for a little while before doing that.
I can see we have a hand up, but just to quickly go to Ian McNiven, who has commended the presentation and then also said, can you please say something about Trevor Haddon, which is intriguing to me, because who is Trevor Haddon?
Right. Well, first of all, just to say thank you very much for coming in all the way from Australia. I think you might even be in Torres Strait by now. I'm not sure. Jude probably knows more. Trevor was Haddon's brother.
And an artist.
He was an semi-successful artist who, for some of Haddon's publications, Haddon would do the basic sketches, but he sort of finished them off, and he was employed for that particular article to do the colored sketches.
Yeah.
So Joy, would you like to come up and ask your question?
Hi. Yes, well, it was kind of a reaction to your response to finding out about whether the work was disseminated in Australia, because it does seem a shame, doesn't it, that it all came back to Europe, to Cambridge. But you mentioned a couple of scholars in Oxford. I did my training in Oxford. I did learn about Haddon, as Jeremy probably did too. And the person I taught and used for every single year I spoke to my students about social anthropology was W.H.R. Rivers, and I used his work because I thought that that expedition was so ahead of its time in respecting people. And, you know, I just thought your talk was great. Thank you very much. But I'm sad that more dissemination didn't happen at the time. And W.H.R. Rivers went off and became a psychologist and looked after people who were, well, you probably know what happened to W.H.R. Rivers. I don't need to tell you that. But anyway, I'd just like you to know that there were some of us learning about Haddon.
Thank you.
Some of us old.
Thank you very much, Joy. That's very encouraging to hear that you know, that you were taught things about the expedition. I mean,
so sorry, you mentioned a couple of Oxford people in Oxford. You didn't say their names. I just wondered who they were, who brought it back and did pass it on.
Well, he had close relationships with Balfour. I'm not sure exactly when.
Oh, okay.
When Balfour left. Yes. And it's good that you mentioned Rivers, because of course, some people, and I saw here in the chat, I'm trying to keep my eye on a couple of different things, that Jeremy McClancy also made a reference to the fact that Jeremy Beckett, you know, sort of praised Williams Rivers, but not so much Haddon intellectually. And I think part of that, I mean, Haddon was a sort of mover and shaker in a certain sense. His theories of evolution and later diffusion were soon considered to be obsolete. And I don't think, I mean, Haddon was a great ethnographer in a way, but he wasn't such a great theorist. And I think that was, you know, the point that was being made there. And the theories that he did have, you know, soon were swept away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joy.
Thank you, Joy. Just also going through the chat, we're getting quite a lot of nice appreciation from Mary McEwen saying you've done such a thorough and valuable job compiling the book. Claire Risbeth saying, sorry, I have to leave now. I believe that's a member of the Haddon family, but thanking you. So that's great. Any last questions before we wind up? Jeremy's asking, is there a biography of Haddon planned?
Not by us anyway.
We, yes, not at this stage. But I'm sure. I mean, there is a biography by Quiggin called Haddon the Headhunter, which I can't remember the exact date of that. Can you, Jude? But it's a rather antiquated.
It's around the 30s, 35.
It's around an antiquated thing. And I suppose when we produced the centennial volume in 1998, there's a fair bit in there, a fair bit of biographical information about Haddon, but it is not a biography.
But you, Anita, have also written on some of his work in North America, which I think is another sort of gives a bit more of that biography. So in your work, you have done a bit more biographical.
Well, he did some very interesting work with the Blackfoot in 1909 in Montana, aligned with Curtis, the very famous American photographer. And I've done work with those photographs, and they've also gone back to their, we did a workshop in Browning, Montana with Haddon's archives and photographs. And what was interesting is the extent to which our Blackfoot colleagues, and they included genealogies, photographs, and archives, said that they rang true, that he wasn't there for very long, only about 5 weeks. And so he and Rivers both paid tremendous attention to trying to make the recordings as accurate, the documentation as accurate as possible. And they did sort of tests where they would, you know, read things back and forth to each other to, you know, in terms of string figures and other kinds of objects, but also just in terms of accuracy of kinship charts, etc. So they laid down whole methodologies for doing that. And I think it is fascinating that not just in Torres Strait, but elsewhere where Haddon happened to work, that the indigenous people to whom he was referring welcome the material and value it as something that is an accurate, if not complete, certainly not complete, study of them.
And the references are coming through in the chat. So there's Sandra Rouse's PhD is a good biography, but apparently Kieran Walsh says Burkhan has just commissioned a new biography, so there will be a biography.
Right.
I might take the final question actually as a nice place to end, which is a bit of a difficult question, but also a fitting one for the end, and it connects a little bit to a question Jeremy's put in the chat. I just wondered if you could speak a bit about the discussion that is happening in Torres Strait about return and repatriation, and how that has been about what role that discussion, if there is one, has played in your work, and how you see it fitting in with the broader projects that you've been working on to return the knowledge through the publication and also the exhibition and other research practices that you've obviously been doing for so long.
Right. Well, I should probably speak to that. We haven't received a claim for the repatriation of any of the artifacts, but there have been informal discussions both between islanders and also with Jude and myself with the islanders about, in the longer term, where some of that material should ultimately be. And I don't think, and I should say that the museum is certainly receptive and has protocols in place for repatriation claims. There's still a lot of uncertainty among islanders themselves about where material might be best housed. And partly because the island community is distributed. When you go to Torres Strait, every island you go to, people tell you about the unique characteristics of their island. And so you've got about 18 islands and you've got Thursday Island. So there's still a lot of things to think about there. The reference that you made, I may as well be open about this, the reference that you read out from Ned David in the beginning about bringing ancestors back was something we have discussed a lot. And it refers to a claim that was made primarily for some divination skulls and other skeletal material that is kept in the department, in the Duckworth Laboratory, which is in Bioanth and Archaeology Department. And that's a bit on the back burner, but that is an ongoing claim and one that the museum very much supports. So we will see. Jude, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd say in part that's one of the things that people look to the journals to be able to refine, to be able to have better certainty about where things came from physically in their own environments, who they came from personally, the need to understand Haddon's character better, to understand what's in the reports and to understand how and why he got so many things away from the islands that were of sacred importance. So the journals are really an effort to try and make sure that people have as much information as they need to continue these discussions, which are highly difficult and problematic, even talking within a small community of 400 to 500 people, only 200 of which may live on the islands and the rest distributed throughout Australia. So it is a really complicated situation for many people, with not everybody in absolute agreement and all of those other sorts of things. Similarly, in the museum where I work, which has Torres Strait Islander elders in terms of persons, as well as some material from Torres Strait, there's no interest even in visiting that material quite a lot, because the Haddon material is really the priority for many people to understand and work through first. So once people can really work with that, then they may go forward and look at other collections and do other things with them. But it is an immense legacy that he left, and that their ancestors left, which people are working through now.
Thank you. I think we've come to the close of our event. I want to thank Haneen and Amanda and the RAI for hosting and for excellent organisation, but also mainly to thank Anita and Jude, particularly Jude for staying up so late, but in giving such a cogent and clear presentation with such beautiful images and sharing the work of the journals. And I really encourage you all to actually get a physical copy of the book, because it's really quite beautiful and you really need to see the images on the paper. Actually, I think it works very much better as a book than on a screen, actually. So yes, maybe we can all give a clap. I don't know how that works, but we can. And thank you all very much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your days.
And thank you.
Thank you all for coming.